Hi everyone. In this video, I want to kind of go back to some of the basics, the initial configuration of a switch or a router. This won't be focusing on actual network connectivity. We're not going to worry too much about routing protocols or anything like that. We're really going to focus on just getting the basics set up. So your host names, your passwords. We're going to review some of the commands in the command line interface. So like I said, this will be kind of back to the beginning, like the very basics. I am doing this while following the CCNA Routing and Switching Study Guide, written by Todd Lammel, L-A-M-M-L-E. These specific activities are through Chapter 6, right at the end of Chapter 6. So we'll go ahead and just kind of dig into it here. I am doing this through Packet Tracer, which is virtualization software, really, for Cisco hardware. So we're going to start with just one router, and I'm actually going to shut it down really quickly, and I want to add some serial interfaces because we do want to look at clock rates towards the end of this, and then power it back up. Since this is Packet Tracer, I can fast forward time to get it to boot quickly. And I'm just going to go ahead and make this window bigger so we can see all the text, or at least more of the text. And so we're in the command line interface here. And the first thing that we see is the system configuration dialog here, which shows us that we're in setup mode. I almost always recommend that a user answer no to this question. The basic setup is just that. It's very, very basic. You can set like a host name, some IP addressing, but you're really, really limited in what you can configure with that alone. And so I usually recommend that the user skip it completely and just anticipate getting a little more hands-on with the individual command lines, command line commands, because that'll help build confidence and some experience working with the command line interface. The more you use it, the more comfortable you'll be with it, and the more understanding you'll have of how the command line interface works, how you can use it to configure the entire router, and you'll see a lot more about how all of the commands interact or support each other. So really, the best thing to do is just to get your hands dirty, get directly into the command line interface, skip the setup. Alright, so to begin, the first thing we want to do is come in and we want to, if we hadn't seen this, then it would tell us, if this was not here, it would tell us that there's already a configuration saved on this router that the router loaded, which means somebody's configured something at some point, whether it's just a host name or whether it's a full environment setup. In any case, we're going to erase it completely. And so we're just going to give it the command erase startup configuration. It'll confirm, so we'll say yes by hitting enter. It'll complete the erase, and then we want to go ahead and reload the router, which will cause it basically to reboot without that configuration, since we've deleted that configuration now. Again, I'm going to speed it up so we don't have to wait for it to boot up, and we're going to tell it no again. So that process we just completed was just erasing the old configurations, anything that was saved. If you're working on a real router for your network environment, you might not want to do that. But if this is just a practice router that you've got laying around, or if you're using Packet Tracer, it's a good idea to know how to do that, just in case. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to move on to exploring the user, privileged, and configuration modes. So from here, I'm just going to go ahead and give it a question mark. You see, all I did was type the question mark. You don't have to hit enter, just hit the question mark, and it'll display the available commands to you at that level. Since my window's fairly large, it was able to display everything that's available here. And so this is for the user mode. Not a whole lot that we can do. We can kind of view some basic things, but not a lot that we can actually do to set this up to work in our network. Next, we're going to go ahead and we'll just type enable, and this brings us up into the privileged mode, where we can change and view the specific router configurations. So we can view our available commands here. We see there's quite a few more, and there's even more that haven't displayed. When you see that, you can view more commands one at a time with the Enter key, or you can hit space to display the next page of commands. And so you can view through all, or look through all of those. And then the next step that we want to take is to get up into the global configuration mode. And we'll do that by typing configure. And anytime, I recommend, for most users, get comfortable and familiar with the shorthand. You can type out the full command configure. You can type part of it and hit your tab key, and it will complete the command as it expects specific components of that command to fall in. The other option is to use the shorthand, which is just conf and then T for terminal. And I'll show you that with just configure, if you hit enter, it'll ask which portion you want to configure, and terminal is the default. So you can just hit enter again, and it'll take you into configuration terminal mode. So again, from here, we can view even more commands. So there's one page, there's another page. At any time, if you find what you're looking for, say I was looking for NTP, for example, I don't need to see the rest of the commands. You can hit any key other than space or enter to interrupt, and it'll stop displaying your commands. Get right back to being ready for a command from you. So from here, we can actually go in directly to specific interfaces. Sorry, router, gigabit Ethernet. There we go. And so this would allow me to configure the gigabit Ethernet port specifically on this router. We see that we have 2 gigabit Ethernet ports, 2 serial ports. It's currently configured with 1 VLAN, and it looks like all of these are shut down. So from the interface itself, we would give like the no shutdown command to bring that interface online, and then it would be ready to connect to another device. For example, if we had a generic computer up here, go ahead and throw these two together really quickly. And so that way it's available to connect, and it will use the port. The other ports that show, for example, if we go into interface G00, this port is actually shut down, and we can verify that by connecting our computer directly to it. And we see that it's red, meaning there's no data transmission happening across that port. So we'll leave it in G01 to show that we have connectivity. This doesn't mean it's set up and ready for use in the network yet. It just means that that port is functional. We still have quite a bit of configuration to do. From inside the interface itself, we can do another question mark and view all the commands available here. And when we're inside of configuring one interface, we can immediately hop directly over to another without any problems. Anytime you're into a certain level and you want to back out, you can use the exit command to go one step out. So from an interface level, we can use exit to go back to the global configuration level, and then we can use exit to go back to the user exec level, or from any point we can usually type end, and it'll take us all the way back out to the privilege exec. Alright, so let's go ahead. We're going to come back in to an interface, and let's just look at some of these. So let's use the command encapsulation, and let's see what's available under that. So we start the command with encapsulation, and let's give it another question mark because we don't know what else is available from it. And so it displays the 3 options, so we can view or configure encapsulation depending on how we want this network set up. Alright, so we could exit again, or we could type exit to go back at one level, or you can do Control Z to go all the way back out. It does the same thing as the command end. And from here, we can do another exit to go back to the user configuration level, or we can type disable. Because we use enable to get in, we can disable to get back out. Alright, so we'll start in the privileged mode. We're moving into lab 6.3, so the third one out of 6, I believe. Alright, so we're going to look at some specific commands. So we'll start with a question mark. I'm going to go ahead and interrupt it there because I see what I want to look at. So for example, if I want to go in and work on the clock itself, I want to configure the clock, the date, the time zone, we'll need to start somewhere. So we see that we have a command for clock. So I'm going to type CL and then a question mark. And it will display both of the options that start with CL. If I try to do CL and then complete the command for configuring the clock, it'll tell me it's ambiguous because it doesn't know which command I want to be looking through. Alright, so we want to work on the clock, so we'll do clock with another question mark. And we see the only option there is to set the clock. So we'll do set, and then what else does it need? It needs the time. When you're doing this, keep in mind that it is looking for the UTC time, Greenwich Mean Time, which is 0 offset. If you're in a different time zone, you'll have an offset, so you want to do the math to figure out where UTC 0 offset would be. For example, here it is 2 p.m. and I'm at an offset of -7, so it's actually 9 p.m. UTC. So I want to configure this for 9 p.m. and then set my time zone. And we can't just use 9 because it will see this as 9 a.m. It can't differentiate between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. except that 9 will always be 9 a.m. and to get p.m. you add 12 hours. So it would be 21:10. If you're not familiar with that kind of a time format, I believe most militaries use a very similar format, if not this exact format. So you might need to research that a little bit and get familiar with PM times in a 24-hour clock rather than the 12-hour that most people are comfortable with. We're just going to continue on. Beyond the specific time of day, we'll also need to give the day of the month of the year, and we should also give the year just to have a full configuration. So for example, today is 05 February of 2016, and so this will build that full command. Then we can do the show clock command to review what time it is. And we see that by default it initially assigns UTC time zone, which is a 0 offset, as I mentioned, but I'm at a -7 offset in Mountain Standard Time. So we'll need to go and configure my time zone now. So we're going to come up into the global configuration mode, and we're going to give the command clock. I'm going to go ahead and drop a question mark here so we can see the time zone is available. And we'll just do this one step at a time. It does ask for the word name of the time zone. If you're not familiar with all of them, they are available on Cisco's website. These are the US and Canada. So the word here and what time zone it corresponds to on the right. So for example, I am using Mountain Standard Time. I'll use MST. And then it'll ask for the hour offset. I'm at -7. And then it'll ask for the minute offset, which is -0, or just 0. then I can go back out to my privilege exec mode and have it show me the clock again. And now my time zone is correct. And you see that it automatically readjusted the time itself to match my time zone. So your initial configuration should be in UTC, and it will automatically adjust when you reconfigure your time zone. Alright, so from here, we can go through some of the keyboard shortcuts. Let me see if I can get a visual keyboard up here. Sorry about that, hit the wrong button. There we go. So now I have a keyboard up. And so we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of the options that we have with our keyboard commands or keyboard shortcuts specifically. So let's go ahead and just put in a fairly lengthy command here. And I didn't hit enter because I want to play with this command a little bit. So we have several options. We can use Control A, and that will bring us back to the beginning of the line in case we missed part or a letter at the beginning. So Control A will let us come and input that. We can use Control E to get to the end of the line. We can use Control F. Let me see if these will work in Packet Tracer. Control B will move me back one character without deleting, and Control F should move me forward one character without deleting. If we do hit enter, there is no access list, there's nothing to show, but it did accept the command without errors. We can use either the up arrow or Control P to cycle back through previous commands. Either way, and then the down arrow to come to more recent commands. Alright, so that's all for the keyboard shortcuts. We can do show history, which will show a list of the commands that I've used recently. We can adjust the size of this history, and we can have it remember 0 through 256 different commands. The default is 8, I believe. Nope, default is 10, rather. So we could set it to 8, we could set it to 20, whatever we wanted to do. I'll set it back to 8. And then show history again. You'll see the list is much shorter, so you can control how many that you're able to review that way. We also have the option of configuring whether or not it will accept those keyboard shortcuts. We can do terminal no editing, and this command will prevent it from accepting the keyboard shortcuts, the Control A, Control E, all of those. If you notice that, well, perhaps this won't even work in Packet Tracer. In real hardware it should. I guess Packet Tracer won't accept it. In any case, if you're working with real hardware and you use that command, you can undo it by giving the terminal editing command, and that will re-enable your keyboard shortcuts. So a few more. We have, I believe I mentioned, if you have show run, and if you have part of a command and you hit tab, it will auto-complete the command for you. So it will accept this as shorthand. But if you want to view the full command, you can hit tab, and it'll accept it either way. Another example, we can do sh for show. The shorthand is sh. And we can do start with tab, and it'll show the full command startup config. You also have a couple more shortcuts that I haven't mentioned. Control U will erase an entire line like that. Control W will delete one word at a time. This one isn't mentioned that I see here in the book, but if you type in some random command and it's trying to translate, you can use Control-Shift-6 to interrupt the translation and tell it to stop. The other way is to configure it not to do that with no IP domain lookup. Don't worry about that command for now. Just know that you can interrupt that with Control-Shift-6. Alright, so our next lab is working on saving a configuration. So since we haven't saved anything yet, let's go ahead and give it the show startup command. And it'll tell us that there's no configuration present. It doesn't have a startup yet because we haven't saved anything that we've done. So we're going to save it with copy run start. And again, that's all shorthand. It's actually copy running config to the startup config. And confirm with enter. And that way it saves our running configuration to the NVRAM. And then we can view the current build. And we can compare that to what's stored in NVRAM. And we could go ahead here and erase again. I'm not going to bother. I haven't changed anything significant, so we'll just continue on. So the next thing we're going to work on is setting passwords, and I might go a little bit beyond what the book has here initially and set up maybe like a local login account. We'll see as we get into it. So to begin, we want to get into our global configuration mode, and we want to enable a secret password. And let's keep it fairly simple. I'll just use my name. In this case, the third word in this command will be the password. So you do not want to use enable secret password and then try to use a password, because password will become your password. So we'll do that. And let's see what happens if I exit all the way out and I try to come back in. It'll prompt me for that password. Keep in mind that when it does that, it will not display the characters as you type them. Let's show you that again. We go to enable, and let me bring that keyboard back up. Just so you can see that it will not show the characters. Make sure it's actually capturing here. So keep that in mind. You have to be careful not to make spelling errors or typing errors when putting in that password, because you have no way of knowing for sure until you hit enter. From there we can come back in and say we want to remove that password. We just give the command no enable secret, and that way when we come back in it will not prompt us anymore. So you can set them up and remove them quite easily. There is another password that can be used to enter the privilege exec mode. It's called the enable password. And you can use it, but it's not as secure. It's not encrypted, and it's kind of old and outdated. The enable secret is much more secure. You can see that you have both options here. For the most part, I would almost always recommend using a secret rather than the plaintext password. If you do have a password set and then you set a secret, the password will not be used. It will use a secret and override a password. Alright, so from here, there are also a few additional passwords that we would probably want to set. We have several ways of interfacing with this command line. I'm connected with a PC right now. There's no IP address set up on my router, but if that interface had an IP address, I could use Telnet or SSH, some kind of client, to create a virtual terminal into the router from the computer. Another option would be through a console cable from a machine to the router. And then the third option, let me see if I can have it pull it up here. Let's see the cable type I'm looking for. So we'll just play with this one. The auxiliary option here. If your machine doesn't have a serial port and you can't hook up a console cable, you can build what's called a rolled cable. I'm not going to get into cabling, but know that it does exist, where you can connect this auxiliary port directly to an Ethernet port on your PC. So if you do not have a serial port and you need to configure a router, take a look at rolled cables. I believe they are also called auxiliary cables, but that's a very broad term, auxiliary cable. So narrow it down, look for rolled, R-O-L-L-E-D cables. For now, I'll leave that hooked up to the console port. And so we have the console port is one way in, a virtual terminal over the network is another way in, and then the auxiliary port is another way in, and all of those can be used to modify this configuration. In a real environment, you probably don't want to leave all of these connection possibilities open, or at least don't leave them unsecured, because anybody could connect and erase your configuration, modify your configuration, and create all kinds of problems on your network. So we're going to look into password protecting these interfaces. So we'll begin with the console cable, and I want to show you how that would work from a PC. You'd need some sort of terminal emulator. PuTTY is fairly common. I believe Terra Nova was another similar application that would do the exact same thing. In Packet Tracer, we have terminal configuration, which is nowhere near as robust, but it will get the job done. And we see that we come in and we are directly into the router. We can do that again just to verify. He comes directly in, there's no passwords or anything, so this user could come in and just destroy everything. Obviously we don't want that, so we'll set up a password. So we'll begin by going through line console 0. The next thing we want to do is to turn authentication on with the login command. It'll tell us that login is actually completely disabled through that console port until we set a password for it. So if you just don't want anybody to be able to use it, you could do that. But then if you ever need to use it, you can't. So I recommend just set a password on it. And so we do that with the command password. And then we set our password. For example, I'll set my name. And then I'm going to give it the login command again, just to make sure that it enabled authentication. So that's for the console connection from the PC or from a computer. If we have IP addressing set up on this, then we have virtual terminals that can also be used to log in to configure the router. And so we'll want to set a password on those as well. And those are VTY, or virtual terminal interfaces. The number of terminal interfaces that your machine has, or that your router has, will be dependent on the specific model. So to view how many you have, you can use your question mark. So this tells me that I have from 0 through 15 total. In a real environment, I don't see why I would need to leave that many open unless I'm a very massive environment and have network engineers constantly doing little tweaks and modifications. Honestly, I don't even see using 5 of those at a time, but I'll enable 5. So I'll use 0 through 4. We'll set up a password again and enable authentication. And then I want to shut down it looks like they may already be, or it won't accept that. In any case, we will disable the other ones so that nobody can use those, and that will limit the number of connections to 5. So 5 simultaneous connections. Our last option there was auxiliary. I believe there's only one, so it will be number 0. And we'll do the same thing, password, and log in. There is one additional step that we can do to kind of help things a little bit. When somebody connects from a machine with a console cable, or if they use a virtual terminal, by default I believe it will time out after 10 minutes of inactivity. So if their console just sits there with no commands being passed to the router, if it sits for 10 minutes, the router will automatically disconnect that user. So we can come back in to our console interface, and we can give the exec timeout. So you have minutes and seconds. If you set 0 minutes, 0 seconds, it will never time out. So the connection will only close when either the physical cable is disconnected or the user closes their terminal emulator. Again, I believe Cisco default is 10 minutes and 0 seconds. Most users probably would be fine with 20 minutes in case they need to stop and do a little bit of research or do the math on subnetting or whatever the case may be. 20 minutes, I'm sure, would be fine for most users. And so that'll give 20 minutes before it times out and disconnects the user. One other thing that we can do is give the command logging synchronous. And this is helpful for a lot of users, especially if they're doing configuration of interfaces or VLANs. When a cable is connected or disconnected, we'll get a few of them up there. Or if a protocol comes online, whatever the case may be, the router will output the new information regarding that interface. So if I am working on a command, let's say for example we're setting up an access list, and these connections become active or disabled, whatever the case may be. Without logging synchronous, these outputs, this information, will display right in the middle of my command, which makes it a little bit difficult to make sure that your command is built properly. If you're positive that it is, it will still accept the command. It won't interfere with the coding at all or the configuration at all. It's just kind of distracting and can make it hard to ensure that your command is built correctly. So logging synchronous forces it to create a new line when it displays those information or warnings, and it will continue at the end of all of that from wherever your command was, so you don't have to retype or try to figure out where you were. It'll be as though it didn't interrupt you at all. So that's also very helpful. Alright, so we're going to move on now to the last portion. We work on setting up the host name, some descriptions, IP addressing, and that clock rate that I mentioned at the very beginning. So we want to be in the privilege exec mode. And the first thing we want to do is configure the host name. So we actually want to come back into the global configuration mode and configure the host name. There we are. Note that host name is one word for the command. And then the name of that you want to give the device. Right now the host name is just router. You'd probably want it to be something a little bit more specific, maybe room 22 west, depending on your environment. This is just an example. It is important to note that the device name has to be one continuous word without spaces. So if you need a space, you can either omit it completely or use a character like an underscore in order to rename the router. Or you can just omit the other word entirely. Again, depends on your environment and how you want to have it set up. One thing that Cisco recommends, just for sanity's sake, is make it something that is unique, or semi-unique at least, and is a good indicator of where that router is located, either physically or logically, so that if you need to troubleshoot it, especially on the hardware side, you know exactly which router you need to go look at. So that can be the name of the uplink or downlink. So if this was my main router directly to Boise, Idaho, then I might name it Boise, so I know that that's my main link to Boise. Maybe it's to the ISP or whatever the case may be. So that way I would know. Another way to do it could be name it the edge if it's your edge router. So again, how you name it, really up to you and kind of dependent on your network environment. For now, I will just leave it router A. It's very generic. You wouldn't want to do it in real life, but for demonstration purposes, it'll work. Alright, so the next thing that we want to do is to set up some banners. Banners are just messages that display when users connect or log in. I'm going to look at two types of banners. One will be a login banner, the other will be a message of the day banner. So there are 4 or 5 different types of banners you can use. You can have one at the executive process level, when a line becomes active, like a VTY line becomes active, it'll display a message. The login banner is for all connected terminals. It displays after the message of the day, but before it prompts for login. So they'll see that before they're prompted for their credentials. The message of the day will be the first banner displayed when a connection is established. So it'll be the first message or the first banner that your users will see. The fourth banner type is the incoming banner, and that will be displayed when there is an incoming connection to a terminal line from a host on the network. The last one, I'm trying to remember what it is. There is another one. I haven't configured one. I'm not going to worry about focusing on that. We're going to look specifically at the login and the message of the day banners. So we want to be in our global configuration mode. And we're going to start with the message of the day. So to set one up, we give the command banner, MOTD, message of the day. And then we need a delimiting character, something that we won't use in the message, but that tells the switch the message begins, where the message begins and ends. So a lot of times the # would work. If you plan on incorporating a phone number into your message, then maybe the # isn't the best option for you. Maybe you would want to use like the % or something. It really depends on what your message, how you want to set your message up, and what information you want contained in your message. For me, I will go ahead and use the #, and we'll go, this is a message of the day banner with a delimiting character at the end. So the delimiting character says the message begins here and ends here. Alright, and then the other option is the login banner. This is a login banner. Again, it's the same format. If you want to see those, you can do banner with a question mark and see both of the options there. So now let's exit out of everything and see what happens. So as soon as a user connects, this is what they'll see. The message of the day first, and then the login banner before they're prompted for their authentication or their password. And they can come in and configure. If your banners are out of date, you can always update them, or if you just want to remove them, you can do that with the no banner, for example, no banner login, and that will just remove it completely. Alright, so that covers the banners. I think the next thing we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at is assigning IP addresses. For that, it's important to know what interfaces you have and what interfaces you're using. So I have 2 gigabit Ethernet and 2 serial. I'm only using gigabit 01, so we'll look at gig 01 for our configuration. So we want to be in the global configuration mode. And we want to select interface G01, or gigabit Ethernet 01. And then to assign an IP address, we can look through the commands. Let's go ahead and make my window bigger again. And so when we want to assign an IP address, we want to be looking at IP protocols. So we'll start there, and we can build this one piece at a time. In IP, I want to assign an address. And so I just wanted it to be, so we can tell it to pick up a DHCP address if we have a DHCP server or service running anywhere that it can contact. Or we can manually assign a static IP address. And so it'll be a format that should be familiar to most people that work on computers frequently. You need the IP address, and then it will also need the subnet mask. And again, by default, all interfaces on a router are shut down. So if you haven't already, you'll want to give it the no shut command to make sure that interface is online. That does get a little bit tricky with some of your sub-interfaces and VLANs. If it's online and you want to assign an IP address, you'll actually need to shut it down first, then assign your IP address, and then give it the no shut to bring it back online. Because sometimes they have problems if it's online and you try to change it without turning it off. It may not accept the configuration, even though it looks like it did. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. And it's not a bad habit to be in. Shut the interface down, assign or change the IP address, and then bring the interface back online. Another thing we can do, as I mentioned, we kind of want to know which router we're in, so we make that fairly unique or indicative of what router we're working on. Another thing we might want to do is indicate what this interface is actually being used for. I know it's Gigabit Ethernet 01, I know it has an IP address, but we can also assign descriptions. And we could simply say this is like the LAN connection to HR. And that way, if we're troubleshooting, we can see right here, if this said shut down, for example, like all these others do, then I'd know that my HR LAN would have been shut down. So this shows me kind of the basic information for it. And that'll help when you have switches, and you have a 28-port switch or a 48-port switch. A description will let you know what each port is being used for. The catch to that is that if you move cables around or you switch things up, you want to keep your descriptions up to date. Alright, and there's one last thing I believe here that we wanted to look at, and that's in our global configuration mode. We want to look at that serial interface. Note that if you do not have a serial interface, it will tell you that your command is invalid. It doesn't have an interface that matches that. So mine is S000, and it'll let me configure it. So there's a couple of things that we can configure in here. We can look through the commands. We can assign IP addresses just like we do with our Ethernet ports. We can review our encapsulation or configure encapsulation. We can set our bandwidth and our clock rate. So we're going to be using those two commands. Let's go ahead and start with bandwidth. And note that it will take the numeric input of the bandwidth in kilobits. So for example, if it's 1,000 kilobits. And then the other part of that is the clock rate, which is mostly going to be controlling your router to router, which is a serial interface is router to router anyways. So you would want to set on the DCE, and don't worry too much about DCE, DTE. Just know that one needs a controlled clock rate for that connection to be stable and usable. And to configure the clock rate, it's simply clock space rate, and then whatever your clock rate is from this list. We'll go right here, and this is bits per second instead of kilobits per second. And let's say it's maybe 1 million bits per second. And that will establish the clock rate between my two routers. I think that covers most of the basics. This is a fairly lengthy video, and I can't really think of anything specific that I would add into this at this time, so I hope this has been a good refresher or helped answer some of the basic questions if you have them. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to leave them for me below, and I hope to see you all in my next video.